them, and just the entire week is amazing. Right, Carol? Yes. All right, so here we go. So, if you think about Father's Day, if you think back to your father, or again, a father figure in your life, you can probably remember specific times and events and things that as you look back into your life with them that stand out as memorable moments where maybe it impacted you in such a way that it kind of changed your life, or maybe it was an experience that you had with them that was just beneficial, right? And it's something that just stuck out with you. And maybe it was, again, an experience, it might have been a vacation, it might have been just some, like a random talk that you had, right? And we look back on it and we think highly of it. But the events that really made your dads or parents in general, dads and moms, the events that end up defining you and I and who we are, often are the ones that aren't as memorable on the surface. They are times when your commitment to something is tested, or your beliefs, or your integrity, or your strength, right? They're not Instagram moments. They're made in a decision that isn't often seen publicly, a conviction that's held and carried out. Those are the moments that really define who we are, as well as who we're not, and who we're not willing to become. And so as we look at Daniel 6 this week, we're looking at a defining moment for Daniel. And again, he's no longer this 15-year-old or 20-year-old. And if you've heard this story before, which I bet most of us have, we might think he's a younger guy, maybe 30s, maybe 40s, 50s at most. But here, Daniel is in his 80s. And what we'll see him through it isn't a decision that he's made in this moment that we're going to look at today. It's one that we've seen throughout his life, throughout this book, all the way back to the time when he's 15. But you see these defining moments that pop up in his life time and time again. And again, they're not Instagram moments. They're moments where in his private life, he makes a decision and carries it out. And so to set all of this up, let's go to the next slide. And again, we're talking about the Babylonian Empire. They had this was the Assyrian Empire. Babylon had taken it over, and so first they beat Nineveh up here, then they came down to Jerusalem, took exiles back over a period of 3 waves. Daniel was in the first wave, again, likely as a teenager, and so he is over here in Babylon. And that's the ruling empire. Now, as we looked at last week in Daniel 5, you had this group over here, the Medes and the Persians, and they were growing in strength. And so eventually in 539, they come and they take over Babylon. And so if you go to the next one, right, their empire is far more vast than the Babylonians. And so Babylon is here, Jerusalem is about here, but this is the this is the Persian Empire, and this is going to last for a couple hundred years, and so it's all the way from over here, about another 1,000 miles past what the Babylonians had, all the way over through here to Egypt, all the way up over into this area where finally, at about 336, in this little area, you're going to have a guy come along named Alexander. And then he, within about 10 to 13 years, is going to take over the entire empire. But right now, this is what we're looking at, is you have this empire. And so when we get to the part where it says that he divided, the emperor divided up the kingdom into 120 provinces, I mean, you kind of need that in order to have control over this vast kingdom, okay? And so to give you the timeline, let's go to the next slide. 605, Babylon and the allies were defeated the Assyrians at Carchemish, and the remnants Then they came down, they take on Judah, the first deportation, then you have the second deportation, then you have the third deportation in 586, and then in 539, which was where we were last week, Persia comes in, defeats Babylon, pretty much walks through the city after they divert the river Euphrates, and without a fight, take the city. And so that's where we find ourselves as we look at Daniel 6. And so here we go. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them. So you have 120, and then you have 3 that are over those guys, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them, those 3, so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators, among those 3 already highly regarded ones, and the satraps, by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Basically, Daniel is on his way to becoming the prime minister of the Persian Empire. That's not too bad for an exile from the backcountry of Judah. Okay, and so again, you have 120 provinces. Each one of those has a person in charge, and then he appoints 3 regionals that are over 40 each, right? So that way, they are making sure that all the taxes and all the monies are flowing into the kingdom, and that nobody is siphoning off any of the taxes, basically. And so this king of the Persians has heard of Daniel. And again, Daniel isn't young. Daniel was basically, it seems like Daniel was pretty well retired in Babylon. He was called in, and Belshazzar didn't even know him pretty much at first. And so even though Daniel was essentially retired under Belshazzar of Babylon, he's reappointed under Darius. And Darius recognizes quickly what Daniel brings to the table because, again, if you look back to Daniel 5, the Spirit of God was in Daniel. Again, the same Spirit that is within you and I. And so Darius plans to set him up basically as the prime minister. Now, again, Daniel's 80. Here's what that means. Oftentimes in church, like we talk about, what people in their 20s, the 40s, and 50s can do. We talk about the youth, and we bring up verses like, don't let people look down on you because you're young, right? We talk about how the youth is the church, like they're not going to be, like they are the church right now. But what this verse also shows us is that you can be retired for maybe over a decade, and God is like, guess what? You've got work to do. So get up and let's keep going, right? If you're not dead, God is still at work in your life because he's using Daniel when he's in his 80s. And then when it says exceptional qualities, that literally means an exceptional spirit was in him. Right? And so which may go along with what we talked about last week, how the Babylonians, they realized that there's a spirit of, they said the spirit of the gods, because they had multiple gods. They said the spirit of the God is in this guy, Daniel. And the Persians quickly recognize it as well. But when God is at work in your life, and you're following the Spirit, there's always an enemy, and whether it's spiritual forces or worldly ones who will be at work to stop you, and that's what Daniel encounters. But notice one other thing, because once again in his life, Daniel is in the presence of the king. He'll be in the palace with wealth and status and honor, and once again, it's in that place of wealth and status and honor that he's challenged. And his life is on the line. We see that all the way back in Daniel 1. And see, for Daniel, he found that the places of honor and wealth and status, which most people are striving for, he found that to be far more dangerous than being in a pit with lions. And so it goes on. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. Now, this probably isn't all of them. This is probably a small little group of them that are jealous, because I'm guessing those that were over closer to Egypt and closer over to Greece probably didn't even know really what was going on as much, right? But if you're in the Persian Empire and you're close to the seat of power, you're doing what you can to try to get ahead. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." They knew the only way to get to Daniel was to bring him into a conflict where he had to choose between following his God and the culture that he was living in. Which means two things. When they looked at Daniel, his religious convictions were fully seen. They didn't have to guess if he was a Jew. And he didn't try to hide it. He just lived it out. And then second, so his religious convictions were seen, but so was his commitment to God. And that was fully seen as well. And sometimes that can be hard to do because in certain areas, and it might be culture in general, it might be a work culture, depending on your family and who believes in God and who doesn't, it might be a family culture. But sometimes we kind of want to rein it in a little bit because we feel vulnerable otherwise, so we might get attacked or dishonored. And so if your only vulnerability is in your commitment to God, you're actually in pretty good company because you're in the company of Daniel and Paul and Peter and James and John and Esther and Mary and Joshua, Elijah, Elisha, Ezekiel, Isaiah, and you can keep listing, right? All of those people at certain points in their life had to live with the vulnerability of in their commitment to follow God. So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king. Again, they're making it seem much bigger. And said, "May King Darius live forever." The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors, like they are blowing this thing as large as they can, have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Again, most of these rulers that they're naming aren't even in the city of Babylon. They're spread all throughout the kingdom. So what likely happened was these administrators and satraps are probably a very small group. But anytime that you have a very small group of people that want to appear big, they will say things like, "Hey, everybody thinks," or "they say," or "we think." And that should start to set off red flags. And you see that going on in the book of Daniel. They're not naming names and saying, "Hey, John and Bill and Cindy," like right? They're saying like all the satraps, all the governors, all the prefects. So they're trying to make it seem like there's this huge group, so that way they can push forward their agenda. So when you have this unnamed group, that usually means that there's really a small group that's going after an agenda. And they go on, "Now, your majesty, issue the decree, put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed." So King Darius put the decree in writing. See, the Persians had a very notable and overarching belief. We have the Constitution, we have the Bill of Rights, we have things like freedom of speech. That's a pretty important one. We like that one. We use that one as much as we can sometimes, right? Sometimes we don't like it when other people use it. But it's what makes this country this country. Or, because we're in Texas especially, we have the right to bear arms, right? It's a big one. And so we have all these rights. Well, they have an edict in Persia that any law or command issued by the king cannot be changed even by the king himself. So if they can get him to say the words, it's enforceable, and even he can't take it back. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God just as he had done before. Now, there's no law about praying 3 times a day in the Torah. But it's what he did, and it's what made Daniel Daniel. It's what made him in relationship with his God, and that was his commitment. And so when you have the Spirit of God, he's upon Daniel, we know that Daniel is praying. For Daniel, he needed that. That was vital in his relationship. We look at what he's accomplished since Daniel 1. Right? That's what I feel like allowed him to keep going, was his commitment to praying, to be in relationship with God, which sounds kind of like Jesus. And so the question, myself included here, is how many times a day do we pray? Right? I'm not saying there needs to be a hard and fast rule, but I do know that James 5:16 says the prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. So there is something powerful about your prayer in mind, and there is something effective about it. If we want to be as effective as Daniel, as effective as the apostles, like they had to learn how to pray, right? They even said, Jesus, teach us how to pray. He's like, sounds good, let's do it. What if we did pray 3 times a day? Even just for a week? Right? Maybe when we leave here today, that's the challenge for this next week. Just try praying 3 times a day. Because how often maybe you get to the end of the day and you haven't prayed at all. But meanwhile, it's been filled with stresses all throughout it, and you're trying to handle it on your own. Where maybe if we just step back and prayed a little bit, the Spirit of God would come upon us and be like, here's the direction that you need to go. So what if we tried that, just morning, midday, and night? Comes from Psalm 55. Every evening, morning, and noon, I cry out in distress, and he hears my voice. And so if people like Daniel and David needed it, what if we did that too? Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they go as a group to catch him. Because again, they know what he's going to do. He hasn't been shy about hiding his religious convictions. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, majesty, will be thrown into the lion's den? Because I feel like you did, but I don't really remember, so if you could just refresh my memory. The king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. And so the king starts to realize what they've done. Because the Persians accepted other gods from other countries. And so more than that, just like last week when Belshazzar, by using the vessels of the temple to celebrate a pagan festival, challenged God, here Darius knows that by testing Daniel, he's also going to be testing Daniel's God. So once again, we see that essentially a challenge has been issued not just to Daniel, but also to Daniel's God. And just like in chapter 5, God's going to rise to the challenge. Does he need to? Probably not. Right? He knows he's in control. He knows who's in charge. But because he wants to show the Persian Empire, and then later trickle it down to us as well, right? He's going to do something. And so notice how when they come to him, that group said, Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, pays no attention to you. Was that true? No. Right? Daniel has served every king with honor and respect. And so, in a sense, Daniel is guilty of that he's praying to his God, but he's not guilty of disloyalty to the king, which they are charging him with. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said, "Remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed." So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." This all happens within a day, right? Because it says that he made every effort until sundown to save him. So they come to him, he finds out, he works as hard as he can trying to figure out how he can get around it until sundown. Then they come back to him, they're like, "It's got to go forward." So the king gave the order, brought Daniel, threw him in the lion's den. The king said, "May your God, whom you serve, continually rescue you." And you get the sense that the king actually cares about Daniel. And again, how old is Daniel? In his 80s. I've seen people work out of the gym in their 80s that are incredibly amazing, but I don't know if they could take on lions, right? I'm in my 40s. I don't want that battle. And so Daniel's a Persian, and they believe in different cultures, the gods they worship, but he's genuine here because he likes Daniel. He knows there's something special about Daniel. He's hoping that Daniel's God, that your God, and that my God will save him. And it's not far-fetched for him to think that because everyone believed in gods, and so Darius is genuinely hoping that the God of Israel is going to come through to save his prime minister. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace, spent the night without eating, without any entertainment being brought to him. When you can't eat, that is a very stressful place to be in. So we get the sense of what the king is experiencing as well, knowing that his prime minister has been, that he placed himself, issued the decree himself, that it put his prime minister in a place where death was 99.999% certain. And he couldn't even sleep. And so you have this stone with chains that move it in and out of place. And so the barak is set, and then they would take soft clay and place it over the chains, and the king and his nobles would press their rings into it, and then when it hardened, right, no one could remove the rock and pull the chains without breaking the seal. And there's no way you're going to dare to do that without the approval of the kings and the officials. At the first light of dawn, the king got up, hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Daniel answered, "May the king live forever." Darius probably expected silence. Everyone around him certainly expected silence. But he gets the voice of Daniel. "May the king live forever." His first act is to honor the king and say, "May the king live forever." And then he explains why. "My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." Daniel gives all the honor to God, and he's done that continually. He points people to what his God did. Do we do that as well? Or do we say, it was no big deal? Or, yeah, I figured a way to get through it. Or, it wasn't that hard. When we know that it was only by God that we got through a situation. Because again, it makes us vulnerable. Sometimes if we give the glory and honor to God. And so the pits we endure and the vulnerability that we struggle with give us the greatest platform, though, to proclaim that God is at work. Because then it becomes God's not something just in the abstract. He becomes something real in your life. And you have a story. And people can't doubt your story. They couldn't doubt Daniel's story. The king was overjoyed, gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in. They were thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. Before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed their bones. Why? Because the lions haven't eaten in a very, very long time. So that verse matters because it's saying it's not like the lions had brisket and steak. They were hungry. And so even before these people hit the floor, they're done for. But Daniel is safe. And why the whole family? Well, you don't want those kids growing up wanting revenge on you. And so they would oftentimes destroy the whole family. When Alexander is going to end up taking over the empire and rising to power, he uses the death of his father as a catalyst for that. And that's how he starts to get people to join him. So you don't want to leave kids upset and wanting revenge. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth, "May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end." This is what Darius is saying. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. And then the footnote, so Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. But the king says those things. And so just like the kings in Babylon learned that because of Daniel, because he was following the Spirit of God, now this new empire learns it as well, all from an exile from Judah. And so with the defining moment, not only did God reveal something about himself to Daniel, but he also showed through Daniel's convictions who he was to the whole world. And I don't know what your defining moments in your life are. Maybe you're going through one right now and it's weighing on you and you don't quite know what to do. And maybe you feel alone. Maybe there are actual enemies against you. Maybe it's a struggle. But what I do know is that how you handle this may well define not just your life, but how those around you, your friends or family or kids, are impacted and affected. Because if Daniel stopped praying for a month, for those 30 days, which he could have, nothing changes outwardly. But it meant everything to him personally. And so it affected his convictions and his integrity. It affected who he was as a person who followed the God of Israel. And it's because he stuck to those that's what inspired those around him. That's what changed the view of a pagan kingdom, a massive one, the one that he lived in. And again, it trickles down to you and I today, that we can live with our convictions and integrity, even when it feels like we're in a pit, because we have the Spirit of God within us. And so whatever you're going through, right, God is still with you. He's at work, even if it feels like you're in a pit with lions. Let's pray. God, we thank you so much for your servant Daniel. And he, again, was in a place that he didn't plan on being in when he was a kid, nor did he probably really want to be there. He wanted to be back in his homeland. But he was steadfast on you the entire time. And so as you took him through his life and through those situations, and there were many defining moments in his life, he stayed strong in his convictions and his commitment and his strength and his faith to you. And so I ask that you would help us to do the same as well, to recognize that even in the places where we feel vulnerable, and we feel like others are against us, and they might, in fact, actually be, that we will stay strong in our faith and convictions for you. Help us to see you and realize you in a way like Daniel did, like the early church did, like some of the great prophets did. That you might strengthen our faith, but not only our faith, but those around us, our friends, our family, our kids. And through that all, might we bring a world to know you. In Christ's name, amen.